Hello folks, this week's InfoVis lecture is about how we visualize connections. So for most of the subject, we've been looking at relationships between variables. Most of the charts that we look at, most of the visualizations that we build, like this one, describe a relationship between a small number of variables in detail so that you can understand as this goes up, this goes down. Even when we've looked at slightly larger numbers of variables, such as in a parallel coordinates plot, you're still only looking at, say, 4 different variables and how they relate. Here, you've got x, y, z, and v. But what happens when there are so many more variables in something that you're trying to visualize? What happens when the dimensions, when the aspects of data are so great that it isn't really possible to look at them just in terms of how a couple of things relate? When the human capacity to perceive in 2 dimensions, 3 dimensions, and then add maybe color and stroke and saturation and so forth on top of that, when you just run out of dimensions in a visualization, then you have to take a very different perspective. You'll need to think about this not as relationships between 1 or 2 variables, but as a network of relationships between many, many objects. And the reason why we look at that is because the real world is infinitely complex. If you think about a city, or even if you think about a neighborhood or a company or a university, there are so many factors that are changing in such complex emerging ways. To start to understand the system, to start to understand a city, or to start to understand the Twitter behavior of particular famous individuals, then we need to start looking at the whole thing. We need to start by getting a picture of what's going on at the level of a system. And the way to do that is to think of that system in terms of its connections, to start to think about what are the pieces of that system and how do they relate together. Because the more you think about it, this kind of network approach is everywhere in the world, both artificial and natural. Take the ant, for example. An individual ant is a phenomenally stupid creature, and yet somehow, composed only of tens of thousands of those phenomenally stupid individuals, a colony of ants can band together to create bridges so that they can cross over to find food or other resources. That complexity emerges from not individuals, but from the interactions between those individuals. It emerges from the system. So how do we, as designers, start to understand systems? And how do we, as people who are building visualizations, start to get a visual picture of what is going on in a system like that? Because the truth is, there are things that happen, these complex emergent phenomena that happen in our lives every day, that are almost impossible to understand unless you take a network's perspective, unless you start thinking about the system. You think I'm off on some kind of philosophical, academic tirade here, but let me give you an example that might connect to your daily life. Why are there always multiple buses at the same time? Isn't that annoying? Isn't that inefficient? Why doesn't the city schedule them to come 10 minutes apart? Why do I have to wait 20 minutes and then 3 buses all come at once? Well, the answer has to do with the property of the system. Of course, they're not timetabled to come 3 every 20 minutes, but when a bus just happens to be a couple of minutes late, maybe a couple of different folks with mobility issues needed to get onto the bus, so it was slowed down just a few minutes, or maybe the driver slept in. It doesn't matter why, but should one bus happen to be just a little bit slow, there is a positive feedback loop, a pressure upon that bus to get even slower. Because the more time between the bus in front of it and it, the more people who are going to be at the stop. So the more time people have to queue up, and therefore the more time it takes for them all to get on the bus, and thus that bus will get slower and slower until it's right in front of the bus behind it. And unless that bus fills up, which would obviously cause people to be diverted to the bus behind it, it will continue going slow. it will continue getting slower and slower until you have a queue of buses. Because for every person who gets on the slow bus, that's actually one fewer person who gets on the bus behind it. So an emergent property of the system causes them to collapse together. And some researchers at Georgia Tech, actually experimenting on the little campus shuttle that goes around Georgia Tech's campus, found a way to stop this from happening. Don't have a schedule, have headways. Don't have a bus that comes exactly at 10 and another bus that comes at 15 past 10, just have 15-minute gaps between the buses. In order to make the buses run efficiently, you actually have to ask some drivers to wait. In order to get more throughput in the bus, more people through per hour, you have to stop some buses. How counterintuitive is that? You actually need to get the second bus to wait until there is actually a 10-minute gap between it and the one in front of it, so that the same number of people get on each one. That way, the system will actually be better served and there will be lower wait times for buses. Everybody's trips will finish earlier if the bus comes later. That sort of thing is a simple example of why we need to look as systems of many, many interrelated factors to start to get an idea of what controls these emergent phenomena. Because just looking at buses, you would never be able to get that picture. So, thinking about complex systems then, there's a couple of things that you tend to see. They have many pieces, obviously. Many components, many variables, as I've been saying. They also tend to be irreducible. That is, they cannot be reduced. They cannot be broken down into easier to describe parts that, when looked at alone, describe the big problem. Because if you could break it down Lego brick style and say, well, I don't need to understand the whole system, I just need to understand each of these pieces, then you wouldn't need a systems perspective, right? This is kind of the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. Merely talking to 100 people individually about their own beliefs and their own attitudes won't tell you how that community will function. You need to look at the community of 100 people and how they interact together to get some picture. Same with cities. Looking at one building tells you nothing. You need to look at a whole city. Looking at one bus tells you nothing. You need to look at a whole network. And the other property of these sorts of complex problems is emergence. That is, unknown unknowns, things that come out of the interaction of your pieces that you cannot really expect, that you cannot really describe, that do not come directly from changes in the input. You change one piece over here, maybe you have a giant change over here because there's some emergent factor, some new eddy in the system, some new behavior that explodes out of some little combination of things that you didn't expect to see. And so, the domain of graph visualization, the domain of network science, exists for us to try and see what's going on here, to try and get an angle on all of this complexity that lets us understand what's going on just a little bit better. So we talked about this slightly in the Data for Good lecture, the data journalism lecture. We saw a network of visualization of exactly which entity owned which other entity and who served as officers in both corporate entities when it comes to offshoring of billions and billions of dollars to avoid tax. We looked at network visualizations even way back in the first week of this subject, where we started to talk about what's the history of some of the most influential data visualizations over time. Some of you will remember the underground map, actually starting to look at a schematic diagram rather than a topographic diagram, an actual map, of the relationships between subways. But when you look at these tube stations in terms of their diagrammatic relationships, now you actually get just the information you need. I want to get onto this one. What is my path through the network to that one? You don't care about the geography. You're underground in a metal tube full of other humans. You just care about the connectivity, the connections on the network. So let's talk a little bit then about different kinds of networks, how they exist in the world, and how you might want to visualize them. I want to talk particularly about three different properties. This is your little intro to graph theory. The three different properties of networks. If you're keen on any of this stuff, there is a subject that you can take in maths called graph theory. I believe it has 1 or 2 prerequisites. If this is your jam, then go learn from them. They are, as with virtually everything else, infinitely more qualified than me. So I want to talk just about 3 properties then. The difference between trees and graphs, the difference between directed and undirected graphs, and the difference between cyclical and acyclical graphs. First, I want to start by looking at trees. These are the sort of simplest networks as far as I'm concerned, because they all have a hierarchy. Everything starts from a root and then moves down from that. You have children of that, and then children of that, and then children of that. This is a tree structure, right? It's actually usually represented as an upside down tree with the roots at the top and the branches and leaves at the bottom. This occurs everywhere in human society. We are a species obsessed with hierarchy, after all. Chains of command, organizational charts, even family trees. So family tree is something that occurs in nature, although they can also represent societal or cultural factors, marriage, adoption, etc. A family tree shows a hierarchical relationship between ancestors and descendants, right? So here we have Nana and Boba, who are one level above Chili and Bandit, who are in turn one level above Bingo and Bluey. All of you out there with younger siblings or children will understand this particular diagram. But hierarchies exist in other places, not just in organizations or in hierarchically structured things in society. This is a hierarchy of cell potency that exists in our own body. This is actually the ways blood gets made. Hematopoiesis. Obviously not my area of expertise, but let me give you a 20-second summary. Stem cells, as well as multipotent cells that are derived from stem cells, have the capacity to turn into many kinds of cell. This is how your body makes new cells. Obviously, embryonic stem cells, and going all the way back to the initially fertilized egg, the zygote, those are totipotent cells, as in ones that have the capacity to turn into every cell in the human body. But by the time you're a grown adult, there are stem cells in your bone marrow that have the capacity, these are called multipotential hematopoietic cells, that have this is hard to pronounce, have the potential to turn into every kind of cell in the blood system that we have. As a cell moves down this chart, it turns into a more specific kind of cell with a more specific function, but in doing so, it loses the potential to turn into other cells. So your body has to commit how many of the myeloid progenitors am I going to make versus lymphoid progenitors. And then after I've made that decision, how many am I going to turn into this or that, and so on down to red blood cells, plasma cells, lymphoid dendritic cells, etc. The ones down the bottom here are the ones that you may have heard of, macrophages, platelets, etc. These make up the majority of your body. Everything else on this hierarchy are the stages to get there. There are all these different complex signaling structures in the body that say which of these things you should make, and obviously understanding and messing with this is an interesting part of medical research. But hierarchies, therefore, can represent physical structures, but also potential structures. Something can move from this state down to another state, but not back. It can choose from going to here to one of these three, but once it's done that, it's committed. It can't go back up. That's the difference between a tree and a graph. Another example of this kind of tree structure is river systems. This is the Murray-Darling River Basin, the largest river system in Australia. Whenever a drop of water lands as rain anywhere in this area, west of the Great Dividing Range and east of most of the very dry middle bits of the country, that rain will flow downhill into some tributary of some river. And then from there, it will go into a larger river, and so forth. It will just roll down a mountainside into a creek in a valley, but that creek definitely 100% of the time deposits all of its water into a particular tributary, a small river, and then that small river into a larger river, and so on until it reaches the Great Murray-Darling, and then I think it just opened up again. There is a whole ecological disaster that we're papering over here, but assuming the river is working as you are listening to this, sometimes it doesn't, then that will eventually deposit itself into the sea. The point here is that this structure is unidirectional and hierarchical. In this case, things flow from the edges of the tree, the branches, the leaves of the tree, down to the root. But in each case, the relationship is these rivers are a tributary of this river, and then this river is a tributary of this river. So hierarchical systems exist many, many places in the real world. But there are some things that seem kind of hierarchical, but where branches can rejoin. And for this one, I want to go for a bit of a nerdy example. Who here has heard of Choose Your Own Adventure books? This is The Cave of Time, a 1979 book, which happens to be the first in this series of Choose Your Own Adventure books. Who knows what these are? I really miss the interactivity part of actual real physical lectures. I actually just asked you a question and forgot that I was on YouTube. But in Choose Your Own Adventure books, this is something that we as kids who grew up in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s didn't have portable supercomputers back in that point in the mists of history. So we needed to find a way, as nerds, let's be honest, to entertain ourselves. And here comes Choose Your Own Adventure books. In these books, you read through a page and then you got to make a decision. In some later versions, like the wonderful fighting fantasy novels, you even rolled dice to see if you did well at something, turning it into some kind of role-playing game. You made a decision, and then you chose which page to go to next, and then you'd read that page, and you'd go somewhere else, and eventually you'd end up at an ending. So maybe something good happened, maybe something bad happened. And then you'd say, oh, I want to do it again. And you'd go and you'd make a different decision, and the book would end differently every time. In this one, I think there were about 40 different endings. So you can, and some people have, visualize this as a network. The big white circle in the middle is the starting point. You can choose to go one of those ways, and you can, at each page, make a decision that takes you out towards the leaf nodes. The colored nodes on this show you how good the ending is. Like, I mean, did you survive? Did you die? The very dark red ones in Cave of Time, I think you died. And the blue ones are the good endings. This is obviously artist's interpretation. But you can see that this isn't a tree because some of the branches join up. There are sometimes multiple ways to reach a particular page. So it's no longer a tree, it's now a graph, because in a tree, things only ever go out. They can never come back together again. How crazy would it be if rivers joined and then split up and went back into tributaries? That makes no sense, right? Water doesn't go uphill. But in the Cave of Time, there are multiple ways to reach some of the good endings and multiple ways to reach some of the bad ones. That makes this a graph. What are some other examples of graphs? Well, social networks. This is an example. I believe this API has since been disabled, but this is an example visualization of all of someone's Facebook friends and all of the people who are friends with each other from among your friends. So if you do a visualization like this, and you can do some tricks when doing network visualizations to make more connected things go close together. It's called a force-directed visualization. You can see this person in the middle there, and then clusters of friends who are also friends with each other out on the outside. And this isn't a tree, again, even though there's a central root node, the person who we're looking at the friends of, because the friends are friends with each other. This has no direction on the edge. If you're friends with me, I'm friends with you. On other social networks, there is a directionality. On Twitter, you can follow me and I can choose whether to follow you or the other way around, right? You can even use these kinds of graph visualizations to describe someone's behavior. This is called a linkograph. It shows the stages of a design process. This is looking at an architect doing a whole bunch of sketches while they're working on a project and relating every sketch and everything they said about each sketch to each other. What were the ideas, the requirements, the concepts, the things that they wanted to evaluate, the things that they were worried about, the things that they liked? What were the pieces, the ideas in this design artifact? And then when are they revisited in later artifacts? At the top there, the architect in that first little circle of things at the top there is talking about a whole bunch of things that relate to each other. They're all linked together. So they're maybe talking about requirements or broad pictures. And then they seem to stopped relating everything to that initial chunk, and now everything's just related to this sort of idea that they had here. You see, all of these things are then related to that idea. Maybe they settled on an initial concept, and now they're exploring that concept. Then you get this huge chunk of things here in this area. It looks like I'm pointing at the TIE fighter in the background. But you get this huge chunk of things here that all just relate back to an idea about there. So now they're exploring, but these ideas don't connect to each other. They just connect up to that one. So they keep coming back to that thing. They're trying to solve something. And these, they relate way back to these earlier ideas. I suspect they've settled on a solution and they're now thinking about how it satisfies the brief. This visualization is a visualization of the ideas, the processes, the cognition that go into a design process. How do we take something that complicated and start making sense of it? We look at network visualizations. We visualize the connections between many, many things. If you want to know about something outrageously complicated, how about the human body and how we process energy? There are a whole bunch of different processes and enzymes and systems that go into how the human body produces, stores, and uses energy. These are called the metabolic system or the metabolic pathways, as chemicals are turned from one chemical into another one. I don't know anything about this field of study. If you're interested, go take some bioinformatics or biomedical electives. But do you want to see what a visualization of the human metabolic pathways looks like? It looks like this. That's absurd. This is obviously the work of an entire field of research visualized in one thing. But look at all of these molecules and the interactions and the processes. Every one of the edges on this graph is a complex bit of chemistry where energy is created or consumed and other reagents are involved in transforming one thing into another thing. And all of that is happening inside you all the time to keep you alive, to keep your brain going, and keep you able to pay attention to this video. Let's zoom in just on that cycle in the middle, because this is our first example of a directed cyclic graph. That is one where not only do the edges have directions, but those directions are able to form loops. Let's zoom in on that circle in the middle. This is called the glyoxylate cycle, by which your body you know what? It's complicated. I don't fully understand it. I always get this confused with the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle, but I'm pretty sure this is one major part of how your body makes sugars and uses them. You can almost see this as a railway station map, and over on the edge there you have acetyl-CoA. Acetyl coenzyme A, of course, delivers a particular chemical, the acetyl group, to other reactions. It is just a courier that moves this chunk around your body where it is used in almost everything. And this cycle is how your body builds that thing. Cycles exist in the natural world everywhere, of course. The water cycle, the cycle of life, consumption, creation, destruction, primary production of energy into plants, and then that energy going into animals, and then that energy going into other animals, those animals dying, being decomposed, and then the nutrients and energy feeding back into the plants. Again, everything is cyclical if you look at it for long enough. But we as humans are trying to make things more cyclical in our world as well. You may have heard of the idea of a circular economy. That is a circular systems of value creation that do not require additional non-renewable resources in. This is a visualization of Australia's use of plastics as of 2018 at the top. Things have gotten a little bit better since then, but not very much. You can see the blue coming into the process is a huge amount of plastic that has never been used before in Australia, raw materials coming in, manufactured goods coming in, and then that huge orange amount coming out the other side is going to landfill. That's plastic that gets used one time and then gets thrown in the dirt. Only 4% of plastic that was coming into our economy is being recycled and used again. You might think that it's better than that just based on how much you recycle at home, but the truth is the vast majority of plastics are used one time. So how do we make that more cyclical? For the picture that we want, for the 2030 goal, I believe for CSIRO, I think this might have been a proposal rather than a piece of policy. They want to see what would it look like to recycle 50% of the plastic in our systems, to reduce that landfill by a factor of 5, and to reduce the amount of new plastic that we require to run Australia. You might remember this kind of diagram from earlier in the course. These are called Sankey diagrams, by the way. We looked at a visualization of energy flows and where they end up. So what raw materials are turned into what kinds of energy and where that energy is used, in this case in the US. The same sort of picture of the economy. Another way to visualize these complicated connections is to use what's called a chord diagram, which is really the same idea as a Sankey diagram, except instead of laying them out hierarchically as the first set of objects, the second set of objects, and then showing the flows between them, a chord diagram has everything existing on one level and just shows how they're all connected to each other. The assumption here is that everything's connected to everything else, just some more than others. This is a lovely visualization of Pokemon types, what types exist together. You can see, for example, looking at poison type Pokemon, they bifurcate easily. The vast majority of them are either bug type or grass type. So since each of these types has its own strengths or weaknesses, you can use this sort of idea to say, hey, is there a Pokemon with a rare combination that might have different strengths or different weaknesses that others don't, should that happen to be your jam? So that's enough examples about different properties of networks and of different ways to visualize them. I want to talk a little bit about just a couple of kinds of network that have particularly interesting properties and that might affect the way you choose to visualize them. The first one is the small world network. This is based on the idea of, it's a small world, everyone is not directly connected to everyone else, but you're likely to be connected to someone who is connected to everybody. This is that 6 degrees of separation idea. This is an example of a small world network. Color here visualizes how many connections there are from a person or a node of whatever kind to other nodes. So you can see there are just a few high degree, that is highly connected nodes, but there are also only a few extremely low degree nodes, that is nodes that are only connected to one or two others. Most are somewhere in the middle. And what this tends to create is these sort of chains and clusters of connected groups, a bit like what you might see in a social network. Social networks are characterized by strong groupings of people who are all connected to each other, but have a few people on the edge who are connected to other groups. Each group has individuals that are themselves connected to multiple groups. Think about this as you have your friends from school, you have your uni friends, you have your relatives, you have those friends from that trip overseas, you have people interested in this interest or that hobby or whatever. Each of those is its own group, and you are in the center of some groups and on the edge of others, acting as a bridge. So those bridge nodes are the high degree nodes, the very connected people, and then you have the central nodes that are within mostly one or two groups, but highly connected to those particular groups. So you see this in obviously social networks, as we've been talking about, communities of people, either actual social network platforms or the actual connections that you would meet in real communities. But you also see it in other things that are organized along similar lines, like Wikipedia. Wikipedia articles follow the small world principle. You can actually play a game with this, find out the smallest chain of links you need to click from one article to another. You might have heard of the idea of 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, this game which was popular obviously in the 80s and 90s when Kevin Bacon was starring in every movie ever. You can connect any actor, director, producer, anyone in the Hollywood space to Kevin Bacon by fewer than 6 jumps. So you can say Sally Field was in Forrest Gump with Gary Sinise, and Gary Sinise was in Beyond All Boundaries with Kevin Bacon. Most people, it only takes a couple of hops along the network before you can reach Kevin Bacon. Now, the reason why the game is called Kevin Bacon is he's one of those highly connected hub nodes who's been in a lot of things. So this, again, the 6 degrees of separation idea. Another type of network that is superficially similar, but is actually a critically different thing, is a scale-free network. In a scale-free network, most people are only connected to a few others. The key thing about a scale-free network is that there are very few nodes that are very highly connected, and then just a couple of nodes in the middle, and then most nodes are out on the long tail of only a couple of connections. This tends to happen in rich get richer circumstances. So anytime that just a couple of things dominate the field, artistic fields have a few people who are very famous and then a long tail, music, painting, etc. Airline networks have a few massive global hub airports. Each own airline has its own hubs, and then everything else is a spoke that is only connected perhaps by a few things. The internet itself, not Wikipedia, but the whole internet, who links to whom, which pages link to each other, or the vast majority of pages only link to one or two places. And then there are a couple of pages, say Google or Facebook, that link out to many, 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 many things. The more nodes you have in the network, the more the highest degree nodes will suck up as many of those connections as they can. It's this idea of preferential attachment. If there's a new node that's going to connect to the network somewhere, if you were to say that that was to happen randomly, it would be much more likely, preferentially likely, to be connected to one of the already highly connected nodes. It's the idea of the rich get richer. So why do these things matter to you as a designer? If you are trying to visualize network data, it helps to think, what kind of connections am I likely to see? Am I going to see clusters of highly interconnected individuals? That's usually called a clique. Highly connected nodes that are all connected within this one space, but are then only sparsely connected to other groups. Am I likely to see hubs, this spoken hub model where you get one or two nodes connected to almost everything, and then regional hubs that are connected to everything around then, and then little micro cluster hubs out on the side, but then all of the leaf nodes have virtually no connections. What kind of connections there are in a network can help explain its behavior. And that can help explain what kind of visualization tools are the best fit for showing it. But it can also explain the way that that network is going to behave. It can explain, in a little bit, the properties of that complex emergent system that we build these visualizations to try to help understand. To summarize, when you are visualizing connections between many things, when you're going up a level from looking at individual relationships between this variable and this variable, and starting to say, well, I've got too many variables, too many relationships, I want to just say, where are there relationships and where aren't there, rather than diving into the nitty-gritty of explaining each one, then you need to consider, what are the properties of the network? How does the network react? Is it a graph? Is it a tree? Are there directed edges? What do the edges represent? What do the nodes represent? And then what are the properties of the connections between nodes? Are they directed, undirected? Are they able to form cycles? And then, of course, you bring everything back to the purpose of the visualization that you're trying to build. Are you just exploring, in which case you might try to answer many of these questions, or do you have a specific narrative in mind that you want to convey? Because, and this is true, I think, in graph and network visualization more so than it is elsewhere, but it is something that happens throughout complex data visualization. There's so many things out there that just show you a big complex thing and say, wow, this is big and complex. And that's all the information you can pull out of it. As you go into thinking about your final assignment, just remember that saying, wow, isn't this complicated, is not exactly the kind of story that we've taught you to tell in this subject. I'll see you in class.